The Murder Machine by Hugh B. Cave. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Nick Number. The Murder Machine by Hugh B. Cave. It was dusk on the evening of December 7th, 1906, when I first encountered Sir John Harmon. At the moment of his entrance I was standing over the table in my study, a lighted match in my cupped hands and a pipe between my teeth. The pipe was never lit. I heard the lower door slam shut with a violent clatter. The stairs resounded to a series of unsteady footbeats, and the door of my study was flung back. In the opening, staring at me with quiet dignity, stood a young, careless fellow, about 5 feet 10 in height and decidedly dark of complexion. The swagger of his entrance branded him as an adventurer. The ghastly pallor of his face, which was almost colourless, branded him as a man who has found something more than mere adventure. "Dr. Dale?" he demanded. "I am Dr. Dale." He closed the door of the room deliberately, advancing toward me with slow steps. "My name is John Harmon, Sir John Harmon. It is unusual, I suppose," he said quietly, with a slight shrug, "coming at this late hour. I won't keep you long." He faced me silently. A single glance at those strained features convinced me of the reason for his coming. Only one thing can bring such a furtive, restless stare to a man's eyes. Only one thing: fear. "I've come to you, Dale, because—" Sir John's fingers closed heavily over the edge of the table. "Because I am on the verge of going mad." "From fear?" "From fear, yes. I suppose it is easy to discover. A single look at me—" "A single look at you," I said simply, "would convince any man that you are deadly afraid of something. Do you mind telling me just what it is?" He shook his head slowly. The swagger of the poise was gone. He stood upright now with a positive effort, as if the realization of his position had suddenly surged over him. "I do not know," he said quietly. "It is a childish fear. Fear of the dark, you may call it. The cause does not matter, but if something does not take this unholy terror away, the effect will be madness." I watched him in silence for a moment, studying the shrunken outline of his face and the unsteady gleam of his narrowed eyes. I had seen this man before. All London had seen him. His face was constantly appearing in the sporting pages, a swaggering member of the upper set, a man who had been engaged to nearly every beautiful woman in the country, who sought adventure in sport and in night life merely for the sake of living at top speed. And here he stood before me, whitened by fear, the very thing he had so deliberately laughed at. "Dale," he said slowly, "for the past week I have been thinking things that I do not want to think, and doing things completely against my will. Some outside power, God knows what it is controlling my very existence." He stared at me and leaned closer across the table. "Last night, some time before midnight," he told me, "I was sitting alone in my den. Alone, mind you, not a soul was in the house with me. I was reading a novel, and suddenly, as if a living presence had stood in the room and commanded me, I was forced to put the book down. I fought against it, fought to remain in that room and go on reading, and I failed." "Failed?" My reply was a single word of wonder. "I left my home, because I could not help myself. Have you ever been under hypnotism, Dale? Yes? Well, the thing that gripped me was something similar, except that no living person came near me in order to work his hypnotic spell. I went alone the whole way. Through back streets, alleys, filthy dooryards, never once striking a main thoroughfare, until I had crossed the entire city and reached the west side of the square. And there, before a big grey townhouse, I was allowed to stop my mad wandering. The power, whatever it was, broke. Well, I went home." Sir John got to his feet with an effort and stood over me. "Dale," he whispered hoarsely, "what was it?" "You were conscious of every detail?" I asked. "Conscious of the time, of the locality you went to? You are sure it was not some fantastic dream?" "Dream? Is it a dream to have some damnable force move me about like a mechanical robot?" "But you can think of no explanation?" I was a bit skeptical of his story. He turned on me savagely. "I have no explanation, Doctor," he said curtly. "I came to you for the explanation. And while you are thinking over my case during the next few hours, perhaps you can explain this. When I stood before that grey mansion on After Street, alone in the dark, there was murder in my heart. I should have killed the man who lived in that house, had I not been suddenly released from the force that was driving me forward." Sir John turned from me in bitterness. Without offering any word of departure, he pulled open the door and stepped across the sill. The door closed, and I was alone. That was my introduction to Sir John Harmon. I offer it in detail because it was the first of a startling series of events that led to the most terrible case of my career. In my records I have labeled the entire case, "The Affair of the Death Machine." 12 hours after Sir John's departure, which will bring the time to the morning of December 8th, the headlines of the Daily Mail stared up at me from the table. They were black and heavy. Those headlines, and horribly significant. They were: Franklin White, Jr., found murdered. Midnight marauder strangles young society man in West End mansion. I turned the paper hurriedly and read: Between the hours of 1 and 2 o'clock this morning, an unknown murderer entered the home of Franklin White, Jr., well-known West End sportsman, and escaped, leaving behind his strangled victim. Young White, who is a favorite in London upper circles, was discovered in his bed this morning, where he had evidently lain dead for many hours. Police are seeking a motive for the crime, which may have its origin in the fact that White only recently announced his engagement to Margot Vernay, young and exceedingly pretty French debutante. Police say that the murderer was evidently an amateur, and that he made no attempt to cover his crime. Inspector Thomas Drake of Scotland Yard has the case. There was more, much more. Young White had evidently been a decided favorite, and the murder had been so unexpected, so deliberate, that the Mail reporter had made the most of his opportunity for a story. But aside from what I have reprinted, there was only a single short paragraph which claimed my attention. It was this: The White home is not a difficult one to enter. It is a huge grey townhouse, situated just off the square, in After Street. The murderer entered by a low French window, leaving it open. I have copied the words exactly as they were printed. The item does not call for any comment. But I had hardly dropped the paper before she stood before me. I say she. It was Margot Vernay, of course, because for some peculiar reason I had expected her. She stood quietly before me, her cameo face, set in the black of mourning, staring straight into mine. "You know why I have come?" she said quickly. I glanced at the paper on the table before me, and nodded. Her eyes followed my glance. "That is only part of it, Doctor," she said. "I was in love with Franklin, very much, but I have come to you for something more, because you are a famous psychologist and can help me." She sat down quietly, leaning forward so that her arms rested on the table. Her face was white, almost as white as the face of that young adventurer who had come to me on the previous evening, and when she spoke her voice was hardly more than a whisper. "Doctor, for many days now I have been under some strange power, something frightful, that compels me to think and act against my will." She glanced at me suddenly, as if to note the effect of her words. Then: "I was engaged to Franklin for more than a month, Doctor, yet for a week now I have been commanded by some awful force to return to a man who knew me more than 2 years ago. I can't explain it. I did not love this man. I hated him bitterly. Now comes this mad desire, this hungering to go to him. And last night—" Margot Vernay hesitated suddenly. She stared at me searchingly. Then, with renewed courage, she continued: "Last night, Doctor, I was alone. I had retired for the night, and it was late, nearly 3 o'clock. And then I was strangely commanded, by this awful power that has suddenly taken possession of my soul, to go out. I tried to restrain myself, and in the end I found myself walking through the square. I went straight to Franklin White's home. When I reached there it was 3:30. I could hear Big Ben. I went in through the wide French window at the side of the house. I went straight to Franklin's room. Because I could not prevent myself from going." A sob came from Margot's lips. She had half risen from her chair and was holding herself together with a brave effort. I went to her side and stood over her. And she, with a half-crazed laugh, stared up at me. "He was dead when I saw him!" she cried. "Dead! Murdered! That infernal force, whatever it was, had made me go straight to my lover's side, to see him lying there, with those cruel finger marks on his throat. Dead, I tell you. Oh, it is horrible!" She turned suddenly. "When I saw him," she said bitterly, "the sight of him, and the sight of those marks, broke the spell that held me. I crept from the house as if I had killed him. They will probably find out that I was there, and they will accuse me of the murder. It does not matter, but this power, this awful thing that has been controlling me, is there no way to fight it?" I nodded heavily. The memory of that unfortunate fellow who had come to me with the same complaint was still holding me. I was prepared to wash my hands of the whole horrible affair. It was clearly not a medical case, clearly out of my realm. "There is a way to fight it," I said